Hello and welcome to this course on conditionals in Python. In this very first video, we won't be looking at any code at all. Instead, what I want to do here is explain the main idea behind conditionals so that you develop an intuition for them. And then in the following videos, what we'll do is we're going to be layering code on top of that intuition. And then we'll go into the syntax in detail so you'll know how to use these. So let's start with an example. Imagine I go to work every day and I work in this office. At the end of a long day, I'm looking forward to going home. So this is my house, and what I would prefer to do, since it's been a long day and I'm quite tired, is to go straight home. We can call this my default path. And unless something gets in the way, this is what I would prefer to do. But how do I know if something has gotten in the way? Well, there's another step, or another element here called a decision point. And that's the moment just before I leave the office where I ask myself if there's anything in my fridge at home. If there isn't, I'm going to be hungry tonight. So rather than go straight home, what I'll do is I'll swing by the supermarket. We can call this the alternate path. So there are these three elements: a default path, a decision point, and an alternate path. And these are the key ingredients to conditionals. You could say in life, but also in Python. So let's consider an example that's a bit closer to Python. Imagine that this is your code editor, this dark blue square. And on it, you have some green lines. These are lines of code, right? And if you've been writing Python and you haven't been using conditionals until now, this is probably what your code looks like. Every line starts on the far left, as far to the left as possible. And when Python executes your code, it reads the lines one by one. So this is sort of the default path. You can consider that Python is a bit lazy and would rather stay as far to the left as possible, unless something forces Python to take a different path. What conditionals allow us to do is to take one or more lines of code, this is called a suite or a block of code, and indent them. And by indenting them, what we're doing is we're removing these lines of code from the main flow of this program. So this code won't be executed every time that our script gets run. So that's all well and good. We have a main flow of our program and we have an optional block of code. But the problem is Python doesn't know what to do here. It doesn't know if it should run the optional block of code or if it should just ignore it. And that's where the decision point comes in. The decision point is a conditional structure which appears here on the last non-indented line. It contains a Boolean, that is to say, an expression that resolves into true or false. If it's true, then Python will run the indented block of code, and if it's false, then it'll ignore the indented block of code and jump to the next line which isn't indented. A good metaphor for this is a railroad switch. So we have the main flow of this code, and then there's an alternate path. You can think of those as two parallel train tracks. And the decision point is the railroad switch, which decides which path we're going to take. So you can see we have the three key ingredients for conditional structures in Python. There's a default path, there's a decision point, and there's an alternate path. And the decision point determines whether we stay on the default path or we jump onto the alternate path. So that's the main idea behind conditionals. Here we are looking at some code. This is an IDE, which I have open in front of me, and I have a very short, very simple script. It's just 5 lines, 5 print statements. So let's try running that and seeing what it does. So when it runs, it prints 5 statements, right? And this is like a simple agenda for the day. So it starts with getting up and it ends with going to bed. This is going to be useful to explain conditionals because, as I mentioned in the previous video, conditionals allow us to take a block of code and remove it from the main flow of the script. And so just by counting the number of statements that get printed out here, we can see if lines of code ran or didn't run. So let's say that on this particular day, I don't want to mow the lawn. Walking the dog is enough of a task for today, so I want to remove mowing the lawn. The way I would do this, and which we mentioned in the previous video, is by indenting this line. So I'm going to move my cursor here. Then I indent it. Actually, those are 4 spaces. Now watch what happens when I save. So 2 things happened, and you may have had to be paying very close attention to notice them. But the first is that here on line 2, this red squiggly thing appears. So it's telling me that there's something here which the IDE doesn't like. The other thing which happens is that here in the problems tab, there's a 1. So there's at least one problem with my code. I'm going to start by ignoring these warnings and running my code anyway. So this gives me a bit more information. It tells me that there is an unexpected indent. That's the error type. It's an indentation error. So if we think back to that analogy in the previous video with the two train tracks, it's easier to understand this error. What we have here is a main train track running along or starting on the leftmost part of the IDE. What I did when I indented this line of code is I created a new train track, a parallel train track. But the problem is there's no railroad switch, so there's no way to get from one track to the other. And Python doesn't know if it should make the switch or under what circumstances it should make the switch. And that's where the conditional statement comes in. The conditional statement creates a smooth on-ramp to this other parallel train track. And it also gives some reason or some logic to drive the decision whether or not to make that jump. So I'll start by hitting return here. So I have another line. And then on what is now line 2, I'm going to create a conditional structure. And I'll start with an if statement. This is the simplest, most basic conditional expression that we have in Python. And the basic syntax looks like this. It starts with the keyword if, and this is purple, so you can see that my IDE is recognizing this as a keyword, and then it ends with a colon. So the next question becomes, what should come between the if statement and this colon? Well, what we'll have here is a Boolean statement, and a Boolean is some expression which resolves into true or false. Actually, to truthy or falsy, as we'll see in a minute. But let's start with true and false. That's the simplest case we can think of. So I'll set this to true using just the keyword true. And you see that when I save, the problem count disappeared. So now there are no problems, and that red squiggly thing, whose name I don't actually know, is also gone. So Python seems happy with this. Let's try running it and seeing what happens. Okay, so that ran correctly, and we got 5 statements printed out. Now if we go back to these lines 2 and 3, reading this just in English already makes quite a lot of sense. So if something, do what's indented here. And since in this case we said if true, and true is always true, then line 3 gets executed. If we wanted to leave this line out, we would set the Boolean statement on line 2 to false. So let's try running that just to confirm that I'm not making things up. And you see this time 4 lines of code were printed out. So one of them was left out, and the one which was left out was line 3. Okay, so far so good. So true and false are quite straightforward, but there are cases which are not as clear or not as intuitive. And these are values which are referred to as being truthy or falsy. So they're not quite true, not quite false, but they're truthy. So an example of something which is falsy is the number 0. So you can see here, again, we got 4 lines. So 0 is false. Any other number, including negative numbers, is considered truthy. So let's stick with Pythonic tradition and try number 42. And in that case, we get 5 lines. So any number is truthy. Another falsy value is the value none, the keyword none. So if I say if none, then I get 4 lines. None can also be used indirectly. So let's say I had a variable, for instance, a dog's name, and I set that to none. And I say if dog name, then this is still none. It's just via a variable. And that's also considered falsy. Any populated variable is considered truthy. So it doesn't matter what kind of value I have in the variable, that variable will be considered truthy. So for instance, if I name my dog Fido, then that's truthy and 5 lines are being printed out. The actual value doesn't matter. It could be wrong in the larger context of the program. Something else which you will often see used in conditional expressions, and we'll look at this in a little bit more detail in the next video, is comparison operators. So if I were to say that dog name was equal to Fido, which is true, then this would be true. If I say it's different or not equal, then that's falsy. We'll be looking a bit more closely at comparison operators and how they can be combined with conditional expressions in the next video, since the structures we'll be using there lend themselves more easily to comparisons. But this was the if statement, the simplest conditional expression we can have in Python. In this video, I'm going to be showing you how to select one of several code blocks. So I'm going to start with an example which is very similar to what we did in the previous video. So when I run this, all of the lines print out because I've set my condition to true. But what if I have enough time to do one thing? So either I will mow the lawn or I will walk the dog. Well, there's another structure I can use, another keyword, and it sounds a lot like English. So when you read this, even if you're not thinking in a Pythonic way, but just reading English, it's already very intuitive. That keyword is the word else. So let's first run this. And you can see this time 4 lines of code were printed out. Let's step through this code quickly. So Python hits line 2. There's a conditional expression there, and the Boolean is true. So it mows the lawn. Because this ran, then what comes afterwards, or the next indented block, which is after the else, doesn't run. And then it picks up again here on line 6. So you remember that if statements are sort of an on-off switch for an indented block of code. Well, the else gives us an alternative. So if this had been set to false, and then we ran this, we would again get 4 lines printed out, except this time we walk the dog instead of mowing the lawn. So what the else is doing is it's giving us an alternative. If the code which is indented after the if statement doesn't run, then the else will run, but only one of these will run. Okay, so this allows us to select 1 out of 2 code blocks, but what if we have more code blocks which we want to choose from? There's a third statement which we can use, and that's the elif. Elif is a condensation of else if, and you can think of it as an additional if statement. Let me show you with an example. So as I mentioned, the elif is sort of a second if statement. So when this runs, line 2 is false, so this indented block of code gets ignored. Python then hits line 4, this is true, so this will run and will visit grandma. However, the else will be left out, since already one of the preceding ifs or elifs was true. Let's try running this just to make sure I'm telling the truth. And you can see in this case, we visit grandma, but we don't walk the dog and we don't mow the lawn. Okay, so there are a few things to keep in mind here. The first is that in this example, we only have one elif, but actually you could have had many of them. In fact, you can have an arbitrary number of elifs. Another thing to keep in mind is that the else isn't obligatory. We have one here, but you could also just not have one. In that case, it could be possible that no indented blocks of code will run, because it's possible that both the if is false and all of the elifs resolve to false. The else acts as a kind of catch-all, and it'll run if and only if all of the other conditionals was false. Another thing you need to keep in mind is you need to be very careful when writing out these statements. You need to debug carefully, because as soon as one of these statements is true, the others are completely ignored. For example, if I set the very first one to true, and then have something nonsensical here, so this, which is obviously false. If I run this, watch what happens. I didn't get an error, everything went well. And the reason for that is that as soon as Python hits this true Boolean and runs line 3, when it's done with line 3, it jumps down to line 8 and it completely ignores everything here and it doesn't check it for anything. So you can have something like this, which, it's not even wrong, it's just completely invalid and it doesn't get checked. My IDE is warning me, but if you're not using an IDE, if you're just using a flat text editor, or you're just not careful, bugs can slip in this way. So while testing, do make sure that you test every possible condition. Another thing to keep in mind is that the first indented block of code which has a true conditional will run, and the others will be completely left out. So you should pay attention and make sure that you are ordering them according to your own priorities. So the one which is most important to you comes first, so that one runs, in case several conditions are true. In fact, speaking of several true conditions, I can show you what happens when several of these conditions is true. So if I run this, we mow the lawn, but we didn't visit grandma, even though that was true as well. So, to rub this in again, the first true conditional will have its code block executed, and the rest of them will be left out. So if you have an else statement in there, at most, one of these blocks of code will be run. If you have no else statements, it's possible that none of them will be run if they're all false. So in the previous video, I mentioned that in this video, we would circle back to comparison operators and use them in an example here. So I'll make some quick adjustments to my code. Okay, so here on line 1, I've set a temp variable. This is the day's temperature, and it's currently set to 0. So it's kind of a cold day, I have a comment here specifying that these are centigrade. So if the temperature is below 15 degrees centigrade, it's a bit warm, but it's not super hot. It's kind of a good temperature to mow the lawn since that's a physical activity. If the temperature is below 0, then it's quite a cold day, and maybe I should go visit grandma and make sure she's okay. Otherwise, if I did neither of these things, then I can walk the dog, because I have time. So let's see what happens when I run this. So you can see in this case, I mowed the lawn, since the temperature is below 15. This was true, everything else was ignored. Both this condition, the elif, and the if were true. This is a very simple example, but it's a good example of a common use of conditional statements, where you will have some value which falls on some kind of scale, and then using ifs, elifs, and elses, you're responding to those different circumstances and to different values which are allowing you to adjust the way your code responds to those circumstances. So we looked at 3 keywords here. We revisited if. I also introduced elif and else. Please don't forget to test these thoroughly. Make sure that you order the indented blocks of code according to your priorities. And remember, this is a good way to have your code respond to different conditions or different inputs or different things that might be happening. In this video, I'm going to be telling you about 2 things. First, I'm going to introduce ways in which you can write conditional expressions on a single line. And then after that, I'm going to introduce the pass statement. The pass statement isn't actually a conditional expression, but it's something which is useful to know if you're starting to write code which contains conditional expressions. Okay, so let's start with those one-line conditionals. The first one I'm going to show you looks like this. So I set up my conditional over here, and you can see that the IDE is happy. It's not complaining about anything. And next, I bring one or more of the statements which would have been indented up into a single line. So let's see what happens when I run this. So you can see everything ran correctly. I didn't get any errors. My IDE also didn't complain at me. And the way this worked is the conditional expression gets evaluated, the Boolean gets evaluated, in this case it's true, and then all of the lines or all of the statements which follow it and which are separated by semicolons get executed. So this works. My IDE is happy, Python seems happy, there were no errors. What's the problem? Well, this is considered unPythonic. In fact, in PEP 8, you are actively discouraged from using this structure or this pattern. And that might be a bit hard to understand with an example like the one we have here, which is, a bit trivial. But the problem with this way of writing conditional statements on a single line is that they can quickly get out of hand. As soon as you're working on some code which is non-trivial, it might also be code you're not familiar with, so you're reading someone else's code, then this can be quite tricky to understand. And it can get quite confusing and therefore error prone. So I guess what I'm saying is this works, but please don't use it. The main reason I'm showing you how this works, or that it does work, is because you may come across it in some code that you see. And so it's important that you understand what it is you're looking at. So don't daisy chain statements after conditional expressions. What you can do instead is to sandwich conditional expressions between statements. Let me show you what I mean. So here I have a single line on line 1, and there are actually 2 expressions or 2 Python statements, and sandwiched between them is a conditional expression. So if true, else something else. And this is quite intuitive. You can read this just with your English reading hat on rather than your Python hat on, and it already makes a lot of sense. So do this if true, otherwise do something else. And let's see what happens when we run this. So you can see we got up since this is true, but we didn't mow the lawn since this is true, and we've already run this statement. So this is one way in which you can write conditional statements on a single line. This is considered very Pythonic. You're encouraged to use this. The reason this is preferred is because you have 2 statements, right? You're choosing from between 2 statements. So this is much easier for people to wrap their heads around when they're reading your code. Okay, let me reset my code here. So the last thing I wanted to show you in this video is the pass statement. And the pass statement is very useful when you're writing out code and you're including conditional statements. So let's say that I have a program in my head, and right now what I'm doing is I'm typing it and I'm making my idea into a reality. And my idea includes different decision steps. So I could have one here on line 2. And what I've done now is I'm sort of setting up the scaffolding for my code. So I will have a decision structure here, and I will have something which comes here. But I haven't written that yet, and Probably, like many of you, I'm planning on writing my code iteratively, so step by step. And I've saved this work in progress, but you can see that my IDE is already not happy. It's telling me there's a problem. And if I try running this, for instance, because I'm testing my code, I get an error. And the error is that there's nothing indented here. So we have a conditional structure, and this should be a launching off point for potentially an indented block of code. It's a railroad switch, remember? Except we have a railroad switch, but a single train track. So how do we get around this? Well, that's where we can use the pass statement. So this is purple. You can see that it's being recognized by my IDE as a keyword. I no longer have any warnings about problems. I've saved this code already. And when I run it, nothing happens. I didn't get any errors. So what it does is it allows me to build out my scaffolding, sort of the logic that I have in mind, but I don't have to complete all of the indented blocks of code before I can sort of test the rough logic of my solution. So pass statements are very useful for that. So we looked at two things here. We looked at two different ways in which you can write conditional statements on a single line. One of them was a way you should write them, and another was a way you should not be writing them. But you should be aware of both. Next, we looked at the pass statement. So that's it for this video. In the next one, I'll remind you of all of the different things that we looked at in this course and what videos we discussed them in, so that you can go back and review if you need to. This is our summary video, and in it I'm going to go over the main ideas that we saw in each of the previous videos. For each concept we discuss here, I'm going to be reminding you of which video we encountered that topic in, so that if you want to go back and review, you'll know where to find it. In the very first video, in the intro video, we talked about the main ideas behind conditionals in Python. And I mentioned that there are three key elements. There's a default path, so this is sort of the main flow of your script. Then there's a decision point, and finally there's an alternate path. The decision point contains the conditional structure, and it contains a Boolean expression, so something that resolves to true or false, or actually truthy or falsy. And depending on whether or not it's truthy or falsy, then the alternate path gets run, or it doesn't. Next, in the video after that, we looked at the if statement. So the if statement is the simplest conditional expression you can have. The syntax starts with the keyword if, and it ends with a colon. What comes between the if and the colon is a Boolean statement. So this is anything which can be understood as true or false, or truthy or falsy. And you can think of the if statement as a kind of on-off switch for the indented block of code. So if the Boolean resolves to something truthy, then that block of code will be run, and if not, it'll just be ignored and left out. In the video after that, I told you about the elif and else statements. So if is a kind of on-off switch for an indented block of code, then elif and else allow you to make selections between several indented blocks of code. There are a few key things to keep in mind here. One is that the first of these statements, which is true, will have its code block executed, and all of the other ones will simply be left out and ignored. So you have to be careful when you're ordering these. Make sure that the order in which you write them reflects your order of preference. Another thing to keep in mind is that the else is a kind of catch-all. So if none of the Boolean statements in the if or in any of the elifs was true, then the else will run, and it'll always run. The else is optional. You don't have to include one, and you can have as many elifs as you want. But keep in mind that at most, one of the indented blocks of code will run. Next, in the video after that, we looked at single-line conditionals. And there are two ways to write these. The first is actually discouraged. So this is a structure where you have an if statement followed by a colon, and then you have different statements which are separated by semicolons. Now this is discouraged, and it's not considered Pythonic because although the example we looked at was relatively trivial since we want to focus on the syntax, as soon as you're writing something a bit more interesting, so not trivial, then these can get difficult to read and difficult to follow. Another kind of single-line conditional, which is encouraged, is that where you squeeze or you sort of sandwich the conditional structure between two statements. So you have a first statement, then you have an if, Boolean, else, and then a second statement. And this reads pretty much the way you would read it in English. So the first statement will be run if the Boolean is truthy, otherwise the other statement will be run. And that brings us to the end of the last video of this course. I hope you enjoyed this journey. I hope you learned something new. Keep in mind there's always a lot to learn, there's a lot to read, and there's a lot to watch over at Real Python, so I hope you'll be visiting us. And I look forward to seeing you again. Bye bye.